Hello, I'm Mark Fox, and welcome to the Sly as a Fox video newsletter. One of the objectives of today is to shamelessly plug my new book, Da Vinci and the 40 Answers. It talks about the basics of creativity as well as the 40 principles of TRIZ, the theory of inventive problem solving. And I want to touch on a couple of those today. One of the first things I want to talk about is viewpoint. To look at things from a different viewpoint can really give you some creative solutions. And what's going on with the economy today, and everyone constantly, all the journalists and everyone comparing everything what's going on to the Great Depression, I thought maybe we should look at it from a totally different viewpoint.
Hey Steve, it seems like 30 times a day you hear the journalists always talking about since the Great Depression, and they keep talking about how everything's coming to an end and it's a horrible situation. I don't think it's really that bad. And you and I have talked a lot about looking at it from a different viewpoint. So what would be your viewpoint? I mean, is it as bad as everyone's saying about the Great Depression with things like unemployment and housing and financial system? I mean, how does unemployment look like from your point of view?
Yeah, that's a great question. During the Great Depression, unemployment reached 25%. And even when the decade of the 1930s ended, the unemployment rate was still 15%. Well, the unemployment rate today, 6.1%.
Okay, so it's like
totally different.
Yeah, it's like 4 or 5 times higher back then than it is now, right?
Absolutely.
So how about foreclosures and stuff on housing? You hear about that every day, too.
Yeah, if we compare that to the Great Depression, 43.8%, so nearly 45% of all owner-occupied homes in the U.S. had a first mortgage in default back in 1934, so just at the end of the Depression. Right now, only 2.75% of loans are in foreclosure, with an additional 6.41%, or about 6.5%, that were at least 1 month delinquent. So we're still a long ways away from seeing the default rates equal to what we saw in the Great Depression.
So it's 3% now versus almost 44% or something. So it's it's
right. 3% now versus 44 is exactly right.
All right, so it's 10 times worse back then than it is now. How about the banks?
Absolutely.
All the banks failing.
Good question. Is the banks are another great measuring stick. Back in 29 to 33, 40% of banks failed. So wow. in the real meat of the Depression, 40% of all these U.S. deposit institutions were failing. Of course, they didn't have FDIC insurance back then. That didn't come into play until the mid-1930s. But now we've had 15 banks taken over year to date by the FDIC. So 15 banks have failed year to date. That's out of 8,400 banks in the U.S. So that is considerably different. So only 0.2% of banks have failed year to date, as opposed to 40% in the Great Depression.
Okay. Any last comments on anything as bad as what all the journalists are saying it is?
Yeah, that's great, and I do a lot of talking to clients and prospects about that very issue. The one point I like to make is that the market appears to be very, very oversold. If you look at a lot of the key indicators, right now is a great time to get into the market. Do we know how long it's going to take to recover? No. But do we think it's going to recover? Absolutely. If you were to ask everybody out there where they think the market's going to be in the next year, you'll get a lot of I don't knows. But if you ask where the market's going to be in 10 years, everybody's going to say it's going to be higher than it is today. So that's a good indication that we ought to be in.
Okay. All right. Cool. That's Steve Swenson from Commonwealth Financial Network. Thanks a lot for your time, Steve.
You bet.
All right. Take care.
One of the 40 TRIZ principles, or lenses I like to call them, is entitled Preliminary Counteraction. And what it does is it allows you to take steps to counteract a negative action before it happens. About 3 years ago, I was talking to Steve about that lens, and he said, hey, I know something that would work great for your 401k. It's something called Future Guard, which is a preliminary counteraction for your 401k funds. So here's how it works. Your 401k goes into a 10-year contract. That money is invested into historically high-performing stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. And what you're hoping happens over the 10 years is the market continues to go up like it has historically, and you get a 10 to 12% or better return on your money over the 10 years. But if it doesn't, if the market tanks for some reason like it's doing now, there's two other insurance policies that you have. If you look at this graph, the yellow line represents what the market hypothetically could do, and then the blue line is a 5% roll-up component. So it's very similar to having your money in a CD for those 10 years at 5% annual rate, where today you can only get about 4%. And then there's another insurance policy that's called the highest anniversary date. So every year they look at what the value of your portfolio is at that time, and it locks into that dollar value. It can never go backwards. So at the end of 10 years, you get the highest of the three numbers. Whatever the market did, and if the market didn't perform well enough, then you have two other components. It's 5% roll-up and the highest anniversary date as insurance. So it really protects your money over the long term. Now, the only downside to this insurance is it costs 0.6% per year. So on a $100,000 401k, it's going to cost you about $600 a year. But in today's environment, I think that this is potentially an awesome insurance plan. Oh, I almost forgot. If you'd like to get a hold of Steve Swenson and talk to him about your 401k and buying some insurance for it, I'll put some contact information at the end of this newsletter. In the upcoming newsletters, we're going to be covering a series of examples. Hundreds of examples are in this book around the 40 principles of TRIZ, as well as some of the basics of creativity. Next time we'll be covering things in marketing, operations, sales, and how to write great ads. Thanks again for joining me on the Slides of Fox video newsletter. I'll catch you next time. Take care.